Start now. Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome here at the EPC, whether you came personally or online. A very warm welcome to you to the policy dialogue that we will have today, which under the title "Making the EU's Regulatory Environment Fit for Competitive Business." My name is Philipp Lausberg. I'm a policy analyst at the Europe's Political Economy program here at the UPC. And so Europe has been trailing behind the US and other parts of the world, you could say, in productivity especially, but also in competitiveness for a while now. Most drastically, of course, in tech, but also in other fields. But since the COVID crisis and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the issue has become even more urgent. Europe's economy is facing shocks from high energy prices, tightening monetary policy, impacting investment conditions, and a hardening geo-economic environment marked by great power competition and increasing state intervention in the economy, into trade, investment, most clearly exemplified by the giant subsidy program of the US Inflation Reduction Act. So all of this has been further skewing the level playing field and weakening Europe's position, competitive position in the world. Meanwhile, pursuing the green transition represents a unique opportunity for the continent to move towards a carbon neutral economy and to wean itself off Russian gas and oil and gas. So green industry is actually a key for competitiveness now and for economic security. However, the green transition also has a structural impact across economic sectors and industry. European and national regulatory initiatives imply significant compliance costs and burdensome reporting provisions, such, for example, as the monitoring of social and environmental standards across international value chains. Today, we are here to explore the opportunities and the challenges faced by businesses as the European Commission has committed to working actively towards a regulatory framework more suited for competitiveness and growth. So we will look into questions such as what impact does the EU regulatory landscape have on competitiveness of Europe's businesses, starting from SMEs, but also midcaps and large corporates. Are there trade-offs between competitiveness and sustainability in EU regulation? And how can we reduce regulatory burden while at the same time staying on course for the green transition? And finally, also, what role does the single market play in all of this? So these are the overarching questions we will discuss today in this policy dialogue. And to do so, we have assembled a distinguished panel that I now have the pleasure to introduce to you. So to my far right, I'm happy to introduce to you Tsvetelina Kuzmanova. She is Senior Policy Advisor, Sustainable Finance at E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. Thank you very much for coming. To her right, we have Malte Lohan, who is Director General at Orgalim, Europe's technology industries. Malte, also thank you very much for coming. To his right, we have Michael Wimmer, who's Director for Strategy, Better Regulation and Corporate Governance at the Secretariat General of the European Commission. Thanks for coming. And finally, to my right, we have Sylvie Grandjean, Chairwoman of Redex and Vice President of the Mouvement des entreprises de taille intermédiaire, which is the French midcap organization. So thank you as well for making it from Paris. I would now start to address the panel. Malte, the Commission has had competitiveness, better regulation on its agenda for a long time, at least for 15 years. There has been talk about regulatory refit, there's been impact assessments, public consultations, Fit for Future platform has been put in place. There's been a previous commitment to a reduction of 20% of regulation, one in, one out. There's been subsidiarity, proportionality. It's all that's which is in the treaties, but still, businesses still complain about being choked by regulation. Now the Commission is preparing a fresh push to rationalize and to simplify reporting requirements, which are due to be presented in autumn. What do you, Malte, what do you expect from this, and what do you think should be done?
Thank you, Philipp, and good morning to everyone here in the room. Good morning to those joining online as well. First, I think it's really important that EPC is putting on this issue for our dialogue here. And I know there are also other elements to the work that you are doing on this topic, because it's hard to overestimate how important that is. And I know this topic can be difficult. It's easy to get into a sort of sterile ideological conversation, which of course doesn't really move things forward. And so I hope also with the help of EPC and us here and others that are participating in that dialogue, we can make that a productive conversation, because in my mind and for our companies, this is probably the most important part of the conversation of how do we make industry competitive as it reaches net zero. So I wanted to kind of share three thoughts to start with, and then of course I know we will have our conversation. The first is a look at the world through the eyes of our member companies, just to try and describe the reality as they see it. Where does regulation come in? And then a few thoughts on how we can move forward. So let me start with how our companies are looking at this. And our companies are basically the types of companies that Europe always says we want and we are proud of. They are typically smaller companies. They're typically family owned. They are typically very, very export driven. So a lot of their business comes outside of Europe. Even when they're producing here, they're selling all across the world. They're typically cutting edge players in very specific markets: industrial technologies, energy technologies, building technologies, and so on, which is a very, very sophisticated products where European companies, often smaller companies, are global leaders. So this is kind of clean tech in the largest sense. Of course, it's the technologies that are needed for renewables and for decarbonizing our energy grid, but it's also the technologies for efficiency across the board in manufacturing, in buildings, in transport, and so on. It's the technologies for electrification, not just the grid, but the market, the industry, the society that needs to become 100% electric. It's the technologies for circularity. How do we turn our economy into one that makes better use of the materials that are already there and closes the loop? All of this is about technology. So if you look at the aggregate of those sectors, it's about 1/3 of manufacturing in Europe. So it's the largest manufacturing sector in Europe, with over 11 million direct employees in these companies, not counting the tens of millions of additional employees that are dependent on those industries for their jobs. And it's an industry which is naturally, as we go to net zero and as we digitalize, in a growth sector. Right? So it's not an industry which is asking for government handouts because times are changing, the world is mean, and we need support. No, these are the industries for growth of the future. Now, those companies are facing massive headwinds. And a few reasons I wanted to mention that are relevant to our discussion. First, those companies have, of course, learned the lessons of the perma-crisis that we're in. First of all, for the supply chains. So they are, and they have been for the past 2-3 years, radically reviewing how they organize their supply chains to diversify, because we all know the risks of being overly dependent on a few selected suppliers, and to put more resilience into those supply chains. They are doing that in a context of profit margins that are heavily squeezed. That's an important point to keep in mind. And that, of course, has many reasons. There's the energy costs, which remain high. They have stabilized and come down from the peak, but they remain an issue if you compare it to other parts of the world, sometimes 4, 5, 6 times higher than the major competitor markets that we're competing with. Supply chains remain under pressure. Inflation, you all know where it stands. So profit margins under heavy pressure. And these are companies which are, of course, conscious that they need to invest heavily in decarbonization, in becoming green, in digitalizing. Those investments are way beyond the kind of normal types of investments that companies would have to do. So the outlook actually is not good. It should be good, but the outlook is not good. And we've taken a very hard look at this when you adjust for inflation. So you look at the real situation, not the one that inflation hides. We're expecting that turnover in these sectors, again, 1/3 of the industry in Europe, is going to decline by over 2% in this year. And we expect that investments are going to fall by over 7% this year, when they should be going in the opposite direction. So we have a problem. I think that's the first point. Now, where does regulation come in? Of course, it's a fact that we are confronted with a major wave of new legislation. We call that the regulatory tsunami, because that's how it feels to our companies. And that is maybe particularly an issue for our industries, because our companies are horizontal enabling technologies that are supplying lots of other vertical industries, pharma, automotive, chemicals, steel, you name it. So all of the vertical legislation, which is specific to certain sectors, we feel it all. And second, the products we make are extremely complex. We're not talking about a chair or a sofa or a pair of jeans. We're talking about extremely sophisticated connected products, typically with hundreds, if not thousands of components. So all of the different parts of those products are also subject to legislation. So we really feel this wave of new legislation which is coming in. Let me be clear, I don't think that the Commission or any of the other co-legislators has by intention put a disproportionate burden on the industry. I don't think that's what happened. So we are here more as a result of unhappy circumstances where Europe had to adjust to the crisis, where different parts of the legislative system all have their role to play, are all trying to show how they are responding to the crisis. And this is not always a coherent process. So a lot of the burdens, they only appear after a while when they start to be implemented. They're coming from different places, different parts of the Commission, also the other institutions, the member states, and you only feel the weight of this burden that we are talking about when it's too late. And let's be honest, I think there's also a degree of the ends justify the means in this. So if in doubt, regulation is about helping Europe with its green transition. If in doubt, add a little more to it, because we all know how urgent the climate crisis is. So a willingness to cut corners also in terms of how the regulation is made. A couple of recommendations, and then I'll stop there, because there is no silver bullet for this. So how do we make the regulatory environment fit for competitive business? There is no one solution. And I think that's also why politically this is a hard conversation. It doesn't make for an easy headline. A few things just to start the conversation. First, the reporting burden. I really wanted to acknowledge that we see the signs that the Commission is serious about this. And we have heard the commitments from Ursula von der Leyen. I'm seeing this in a lot of different areas. Just this morning, one of the areas that we were looking at is in the context of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And the Commission has proposed that we introduce a materiality requirement for reporting obligations. That would be a big improvement. And there's blowback, inevitably there is going to be political pushback against that kind of test, whether it is material to your business before you declare, thousands and thousands of pages of sustainability reporting information. So I see this, but that's my first point. The issue is much bigger than reporting requirements. So great that we're making progress and let's continue, but that on its own doesn't solve it. Second is the competitiveness check. This was announced, with some fanfare again by the Commission President, and I feel there is a sincerity in that, but the expectations on the industry side are not high. And the reason for that is exactly as you mentioned, Philipp, because it feels like we've been here before. We have heard all the previous statements around better regulations, impact assessment, one in, one out, you name it, and somehow it feels like they never quite became a reality. That may be a perception, so I'm sure the Commission has been working on that. I'm not saying that they haven't, but the perception in the industry is this is the time when you have to make it count, this competitiveness check, because the level of trust that it will make a difference is relatively low. And the third point, let's really elevate the proven models of light touch, lean regulation. We have them. We have the new legislative framework for the internal market. It's the kind of the better regulation par excellence for the internal market, which is light touch. It's been working well for the best part of 30 years. Let's build on that. That requires standards, that requires a level of trust in the industry when they place products on the market, that they can self-certify. That has been a proven model of regulation, and that remains, we think, an important element of placing products on the market for the sophisticated products they represent. And let's use market-based and price-based mechanisms in regulation. I think that is another area where there are some examples, but we should be doing a lot more by incentivizing and nudging the markets rather than prescribing and restricting. Let me pause there because, of course, all of these would require more discussion to be truthful, to do them justice. But happy to pick them up again.
Thanks very much, Malte. Before we continue, I would just like to also point out that everyone who is participating online can ask questions, which will go directly here, so we can consider them. And of course, there will be a Q&A session when we finish. But yeah, I would like to now turn to Michael Wimmer. Yeah, you've heard what Malte said. Expectations are large, of course. Can you tell us what you set up a task force? There are plans for a push in reducing reporting requirements in starting in autumn. What can we expect? And yeah, how will you deal with this?
Good afternoon. Many thanks for the invitation. Many thanks for setting the scene and also for the points that you made and the way that you made them, because I think that's the spirit of the discussion that we should be having. We're sharing, I think, an objective here. And I think together we are looking at how best we can reach those objectives, because I think we agree that the twin transition is something that is important, that we need to go through. It is not a choice. It will ultimately make us more competitive, stronger. But at the same time, there are challenges. These challenges are particularly big in the light of the circumstances that you have been mentioning. And I think the good news and the important point is that these challenges have political attention, certainly on our side. And as the director in charge of better regulation, I can only be happy about that. And this is not only basically a very sophisticated system that we have built until now in terms of better regulation, but importantly, and also responding to these different perspectives that you have been mentioning, also a very strong political drive, some really recent initiatives that are there to complement our system that we have and that are really looking to address those challenges in a meaningful way. I'm not going to list all the different things also that we have put forward, but I just want to mention that things like, for example, the Green Deal industrial plan for net zero, very important element with a number of different components. I mean, the regulatory side, also on the financial side, where we have taken some quite far-reaching measures in terms of, for example, state aid, but also complementing this. If you just looked at last week's proposals in connection with the midterm review of the financial framework, a proposal which is called STEP. More generally, if you look at, we have overall the biggest budget that we have in this financial framework, 2 trillion, if you look at it together with Next Generation EU, 30% of which going really into the green transition, 37% of the RF going into those issues. So there is strong support which is there and that we are mobilizing. But from my perspective, of course, what's particularly important is the regulatory dimension. We have recently put forward a communication also on long-term competitiveness, taking these elements into account, which has a number of drivers, a number of pillars. I'm here as well not going to elaborate on all of them, but I want to mention a couple of things also that have been partially mentioned here and that are particularly important on the regulatory side and from a better regulation perspective. I mean, these are things or elements that are part of that agenda which are important, are one in, one out. The question of the reporting obligations that you have already mentioned, the introduction of a competitiveness check, the SME test, which we have reinforced further. And also, and that is a complicated issue actually, because we rightly hear from businesses, of course, that the problem that businesses have is not necessarily the impact or the implication of a particular individual proposal. But the problem is how all the proposals work together. Where are the inefficiencies and maybe also the incoherences? I mean, I do not deny that may exist. These are unintentional, but these are things which exist. And when we are doing impact assessments, we obviously factor in the baseline, we factor in other developments, but or assessing the cumulative impact of proposals in a methodological sound way is very, very complicated. And that's also an area that we are working on and on which I'm not promising miracle solutions, but I mean, we are very aware of this and investing into it because it is important. Now, a bit more specifically on some of the points that were raised, one in, one out. There are a lot of misunderstandings around that, also what it means. We have applied the one in, one out approach for the first time, 22 fully. We have piloted it previously, but we have implemented it fully. We will very, very shortly put forward the annual burden survey, which is going to report about that. And I'm not going to mention any figure here, but I can tell you a couple of things that this did in terms of our own way we are preparing legislation and that the system works. I mean, it has really had a profound, it's of course a gradual impact, but a very profound impact on the culture in the house because people and DGs need to invest in this. We have now the Regulatory Scrutiny Board in its recent report has confirmed that more than 90% of all relevant proposals have relevant costings, and that's already very important. It's not a change that goes from one day to another, but the culture of the house is moving, and I think that is very important. And there's politically a very strong emphasis on the cost, the burden dimension. Secondly, I mean, in terms of our proposals, we have because we needed that, and we have monitored that very strongly. We will be meeting our requirement in terms of removing more burden than what our proposals would put in. Now, there are imbalances in terms of what are the proposals that deliver that. Things often, we have observed that very often both the ins and the outs are a limited number of big proposals, and that many proposals have costs or cost reductions, but which are at lower levels. But overall, we will have a very significant net burden reduction based on our proposals from the initiatives that are in scope. Now, at the same time, we cannot and have not applied the one in, one out mechanically. And I also want to say that sometimes there's a little bit of misperception that this means one legislative proposal in and one legislative proposal out, which is completely not meaningful because that's unrelated to the burden actually that is there. Roughly a quarter or so, I would say. I mean, it's a very rough figure of our proposals, amending proposals. We have many things that are then also. I mean, it's not a meaningful measure. Our approach is really related to burden, and that's the focus that we have. On the reporting obligations here as well, I think it is quite important, and it is quite important for us. It's quite important for you that politically our president has made a very ambitious, or has formulated a very important ambition. 25% of all reporting requirements, that is very significant, and that will keep us busy quite a bit. That's completely clear. And I agree with you, reporting obligations is not everything, but it's an important element and an important aspect where from what we pick up from you as well, and where we need to look. Now, to be clear, reporting obligations are very often necessary. They're important. You cannot do policies without them. And our agenda is not a deregulatory agenda or an agenda that somehow challenges the policy objectives. But we do recognize that there are inefficiencies, that there are things that we need to look at, and we want to look very critically at these different things. And there are, and this is an important element for a growth-enhancing regulatory framework. There are different aspects that we are looking at, because we do realize that reporting requirements have a cost, in particular for smaller, mid-sized companies. We want to keep that in check, and we want to make a big push. We will be looking also at technological advances to take account of that. Digitalization plays a big role in that. We will. The president has announced first proposals in the autumn. This is not going to fully solve the problem, but I think we will want to show you also with these proposals that we are serious and that we are meaningful, and we will certainly have a sustained investment on those things, and therefore it's, I think it will keep us busy for quite some time. The competitiveness check, and I'll close that we also have a little bit time for discussion, is something that we have introduced in March. You will probably soon see the first impact assessments and proposals that are emerging from the regulatory scrutiny board that apply it. Now, obviously, there's a time lag. But the idea behind it was to have a really comprehensive view on the competitiveness dimension, to also give this aspect visibility for the political decision makers. So it's not just that we have a very comprehensive annex addressing this aspect, but this also needs to be referenced and described, needs to be scored, it needs to be referenced and described in the executive summaries of the impact assessments. It needs to be referenced in the explanatory memoranda of our proposals, which means that those who take the decisions in the Commission, or subsequently then the co-legislators, are required to look at that aspect and to factor that in and balance these implications with any other consideration which are there. That's quite a big change. We have also further strengthened, against the backdrop of this renewed emphasis on competitiveness, we have made changes regarding the regulatory scrutiny board. Competitiveness has always been a very important part, of course, of their work. And all of the members are dealing with competitiveness. And it's one of the three big issues that actually we are looking at in our impact assessments. But we have, first of all, changed the mandate in the sense that this aspect requires particular attention of the board. It said previously only, since the beginning of this mandate, there was only a reference on one in, one out, and the foresight dimension, which were both new and important aspects that the new president brought to, or that the then new president brought on the table. Now there's a third element, which is competitiveness, and two additional members. That the board has been increased by 2 additional members, also against the backdrop of that particular perspective. Then there's, of course, many other things, but again, I don't want to list now everything that we're doing. I mean, on the SME tests, we're also very attentive, of course, to what business are telling us, including in terms of some issues in terms of the practical application. We are trying to take that into account. And we have the Fit for Future platform, which is doing really important work, which determines itself its agenda, and I think where business is very well represented. Maybe just the last word that I wanted to mention is this is really a joint agenda. It needs to be a joint agenda. It is something where we will need to work with you, with stakeholders. We will want to be very attentive to that. We will want your advice. Obviously, the Commission has an important role to play. quite clear. We are completely aware of our responsibility there, and I think we are really strongly investing in these things. It'll be important also that in our work with the co-legislators that these things are then also carried through, because we see very often also, for example, in the trilogue negotiations or whatever. I mean, in particular, when we're talking about reporting requirements, I mean, whenever you cannot solve a problem, there is a bit of a tendency that the co-legislator then adds another element. And that is also important. And also requirements that authorities have or that the Commission have in terms of reporting towards, for example, the co-legislator or the Parliament, the Council, has also an implication for business. Because if we want to do sound reporting and sound evidence-based policy, we need to get that data from somewhere. Actually, even better regulation has a cost in terms of money, but also in terms of generating the information from all of you. And I think the joint challenge that we have is really to strike the right balance here and to work together in a, as you say, non-ideological way. I think that is exactly what we need to do, because then we can really focus on the things that we can do and that we can achieve. And I think on our part, there certainly is a rather strong commitment, in particular lately, around that agenda, and we certainly look very much forward to having your help as well and your advice in where to focus, while obviously wanting still to achieve our policy objectives.
Yeah, thanks very much for this very interesting overview of the work of the Commission, of some of the aspects that you take very importantly now, for example, the cumulative impact of legislation, but also the explanations of how these things like the one in, one out work. I think that's very important to communicate. And of course, you also talked about the importance of requirements, of reporting requirements. And I think the importance of balancing out different interests. And I think that brings me to my next question, which is directed to Tsvetelina. How do you think we can square the goal of increasing competitiveness with achieving the goals of the green transition? Because of course, we all know a lot of regulations that are supposed to increase or decrease the carbon footprint, for example, and other green considerations. They come with a heavy burden of reporting requirements. For example, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive that requires companies to lay open their value chains, and then they have to be able to be tested on that, and it takes a lot of course, it takes a lot of bureaucratic work. So my question is, how do you see we can square these two goals, sustainability and green transition, and how to best design legislation that gets us both?
Thank you. I work on sustainable finance, so I try to look at the money and how to get the needed funding for our businesses. And we are entering this subsidy race, as we call it, a competition of where competitiveness is definitely coming to the forefront, even more so than climate neutrality and climate transition. I truly believe that money is not everything. It is truly important, but I think we also need to, in order to keep businesses competitive, we also need to look at how these businesses are transformed and are future-proofed, and how they can place climate neutrality and climate transition in the heart of their business model. Because competitiveness is also based on innovation and how you ensure that your business model is appropriately fit for both the climate neutrality targets of the EU, but also how this plays within the whole value and supply chains of the companies. The EU response to the Inflation Reduction Act has been more reactive, I would say, when it comes to providing subsidies for the clean industries and clean tech. And it's very good to hear also from Malte and what it actually looks like for smaller companies, because 99% of the European businesses are actually small and medium-sized companies, and we need to also transition them as well. It's interesting that I just wanted to share that earlier this year, I was at a big conference in Europe for the solar industry organized by Solar Power Europe, but there were businesses from all across Europe. And some of the starking realizations that they shared with me is that China is doing things much cheaper, but also much better than us. And solar technology is just the first that comes to mind. And things are obviously much more complicated when we look at different components and different sectors and different industries. And China has been pouring, and on the backdrop of the Inflation Reduction Act and all the public subsidies that will come, that will affect the financing landscape in the US, China has also been heavily subsidizing a lot of their industries. That being said, with that backdrop on the financing part and a lot of subsidy and public finance and public investments, I do feel that, and I do think that it's not only about the money, but as I mentioned, not to perpetuate this thinking of business as usual and to really look at the transition of the businesses as compliance purely from a compliance perspective and as additional burden to comply with the requirements, but also as an opportunity to really change the mindset of different businesses and different industries. And I have to say that with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, with the ESRS, the reporting standards, currently under consultation in the making, with this due diligence directive also in the making, but with several other legislative pieces with the EU, there is already this direction of travel of setting the tone of where businesses need to be. And obviously, the European Union, the European Commission have been approaching this very much from a transparency perspective. No limitations, especially when it comes to investing. No limitations of what you can invest or not invest in, or what businesses should be doing, but more purely from a transparency perspective. And I have to say that it has helped so far. It does help demand pick up when you have more transparency in the market for financial market players and investors. The regulatory framework to some extent does help create the certainty in the market and the clarity of the rules. I mean, we are still getting things right. We are not there yet. But when you have the regulatory framework, there is more trust in those markets and in those businesses as well. With the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, for instance. I hear where, Malte, you're coming from for the materiality assessment, for instance, but transparency and really being able to measure your impacts and also the impact of climate and environment on your operations is really the first basic step. And specifically on the materiality assessment, I do think that I think we also in the latest text we lost the disclosure of your materiality assessment. So businesses will have to conduct on their own account materiality assessment without the proper guidance of how to do that. And also I see that you're already disagreeing with me. And also will not necessarily have to disclose their methodology or how they conduct this materiality assessment. So I think what is needed, I do hear the compliance burden and the additional costs that come with it, but I do also feel that there is the need for just regulatory coherence, and this is the job for everyone and all of us here, but also across the different legislative pieces and the different requirements, also with the due diligence directive, but also with the taxonomy, because we keep hearing from different businesses, especially from smaller companies, and especially in Central and Eastern Europe, it is extremely difficult for them to be able to gather all this information and to really make sense and comply with it, to disclose against it. So for me, it is also a matter of bringing coherence to all this and all the different requirements across the board. And as I started talking about the transition and the due diligence a little bit, I do think that the transition planning across the board, it's also in the ESRS, the reporting standards. emerging as the next important tool also in the due diligence directive, but we do see it in other financing files as well. The European Green Bond Standard has the notion of transition. The taxonomy is also, to some extent, incentivizing transition at both entity company level, but also at a different activity level. So I do think that we have to actually start preparing the businesses of how to properly approach their transition planning and setting their short, medium, long-term thinking. The financing part of how they can attract both, how they can access subsidies and public finance is one thing. And we should definitely put a little bit more effort into this. Just last week, the European Commission announced a STEP and the financing of the Green Deal Industrial Plan and the Net Zero Industry Act. But also those solar companies that I met earlier this year, they didn't know where to access European financing. And I mean, there are a lot of different financing mechanisms, a lot of different funds, but there is just lack of coherence and understanding in this being in one place where businesses and companies can access a lot of this information. And this brings me also to the private financing of how to leverage the access through capital markets for businesses. And capital markets are more developed in some parts of Europe, but in a lot of countries, we really look at more bank-based, loan-based financing for businesses. So we need to take this into account of what the access to financing in different parts of Europe also looks like, and how to really leverage EU funding and public finance to help leverage the private financing as well. And here also, I think within both the ESRS and CSDDD, there is also the element of climate risk and businesses also having to, in their transition thinking, to also start thinking about climate risk and what this means for their business models, what this means for their operations, and to have in place the thinking around mitigating and the planning for mitigating those risks. So in that sense, there is a lot for the business model, the future-proof business model, if we're really thinking of how to make the EU regulatory framework fit for the future and fit for competitiveness. There is really the financing element, but there is also really supporting businesses to start thinking about their transition planning, to really incorporate mainstream the transition thinking into their business models. And in this regard, directors' obligations for big corporations, for instance, is quite important in the due diligence directive. And I would argue that it doesn't come at any competitiveness cost. There is severe opposition by some businesses to incorporate, to link, for instance, the variable remuneration of board of directors with hitting different climate targets. And these are executive bonuses that for the moment are linked only to profit in most cases. So really trying to find, and the Commission in some instances has done some steps towards really incorporating this thinking into the business models of companies. So just to conclude, also with several recommendations, I do feel that coherence is what's really needed at the moment, because there is this transition element and transition planning emerging in different regulatory requirements, in different legislative pieces, in different financing for private financing options. So really to bring coherence of the public and private and the different requirements for businesses and how they can access this finance. Also, capacity building is an important one. Just as I mentioned, a lot of the companies are small and medium-sized companies, and they really need the support, clarity, and coherence to be able to even approach this both in terms of compliance, but just in terms of planning their transition. I'm glad that resilience keeps coming up in the conversation as well. because really being able to in this whole process to look at your climate risks and assess them is also one way to make your business resilient in the long term, both to supply chain shocks, but also in climate and environmental impacts. Yeah, with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you basically said is it's about certainty for business. It's about coherence. It's about transition planning, sort of taking businesses by the hand almost, and creating future-proof regulation and making sure that business models are future-proof. And you also, of course, mentioned the subsidies and the financial angle, which of course is very important. Of course, the Americans, the Chinese have the advantage that they're just one state, and we have a much more complicated environment here. But when it comes to businesses and how they are affected by all of that, I think it's interesting to turn to you, Sylvie, because you are a chairwoman the chairwoman of Redex, a mid-sized industrial company in France, and yeah, you really are the voice of the real economy, so to speak. And I can cite Thierry Breton. He said a while ago that the relative cost of a new norm is €1 for a large company, it's €4 for a mid-cap company, and it's €10 for an SME. And of course, we've already heard also from here Wimmer, there's a SME check. There's a lot of SMEs are supported in many ways or even exempted of some of the regulations. But you are actually representing a mid-cap, and how do you deal with the regulatory burden, reporting requirements, and what would you say should be done?
Thank you, Philipp, for the introduction. Well, it's always difficult to speak the last one. When Malte was speaking at the beginning, I thought he was reading my statements. We are sharing exactly the same analysis about what the situation is today. So I will not continue speaking about what you said, but more speak about what I am. In France, we have this METI. This is a federation of mid-cap companies, over 50 million euros of turnover, less than 1.5 billion, more than 500 employees, 250 employees, and less than 5,000. So it's a specific statistical information that the government has decided to put in place to get the proper information of what we are and what we are building in France. And by doing this statistical category, then they managed to change totally the view of what can be done to reindustrialize France, which was under something completely different in the 2005 years. I'm here to represent my fellow entrepreneurs of mid-cap companies, but I'm here as well to represent my company. And my company, it's 400 employees. It's 70 million euros turnover. 60% is done in Europe. 20% is done in Asia, 20% is done in the US. My competitors are neither French nor European. They are Korean, Japanese, Chinese, and American. So when I have the burden of all those regulations coming from Europe and then emphasized by French lawmakers because they like to add another strat on top of that. The cost for me, it's 2 people. So 2 people, 2 employees, maybe for you it's nothing. We are a large audience today, but 2 people out of my 400 people, that's a lot. And that's a cost, but that's mostly a loss of opportunity of those 2 people being able to create business, to take care of human resources issue, to make people in the group work efficiently, to invest in new technology, to invest in research and development. So it's not only a cost, it's a lack of opportunity. We have done at METI studies showing that the cost today of the burden of the regulation, it's 28 billion, only for the mid-cap French companies. So this is very important that you understand that by putting on us the burden that you are putting on big companies, which maybe could be useful, it gives us not only a burden, but it gives us, we are losing opportunities, and then we are losing our competitiveness. Two people now with the new CRSD, CR3D, it will be one additional. It's not a lot, it's only me, but that's one additional person doing collecting information, which are maybe useful, maybe necessary, but which are not in proportion to what I am and to what my fellow entrepreneurs are. So proportionality is very important. And one thing that you did not mention, Malte, was that not only are we touching many type of businesses and we are in high technology, in company, my company provides solutions for strip processing technology, machine drives, so highly mechanical stuff. Lots of research and development, lots of investment. And we are almost all the same when we are looking at the METI companies in France. What you did not mention is that as we are mid-cap size company, as we are in rural area, as we are most of the time family run, we have a long-term vision. And this long-term vision is totally compatible with sustainability. It's maybe even the root of what we are. So long-term is very important for us. And we would like to emphasize the fact that by putting on our shoulders burdens which are short-term, because we look at that as short-term, what does it bring to us? It brings a lot maybe for the European commissions to analyze, but what does it bring to us? And so proportionality is important. Test validation, we would, of course, we agree to give information, but we want to give information which are meaning to us and useful for you. So building together this type of regulation would be a very important step. We are little by little discussing, and I'm happy I'm here because then I can discuss a little bit more with you. Proportionality, testing together, and fairness. Being fair to what we are in comparison with the competition that we have, which are Chinese and American. And that's the situation as today.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think what you said is pretty clear. It's about proportionality that has to be included, and I think it's it's not the same size of business. It doesn't. You don't get the same impact of irregulation depending on the size. Then testing and validation is important, and the cooperation in doing legislation. And I think this is also what the Commission is planning to do. We'll see how it will be executed, and of course, having a long-term vision is important. You mentioned that France, that you have 28 billion euros of costs for bureaucracy and reporting. France is the second, the country in the second largest, has the second largest regulatory burden in the world. So I'm wondering how much of this reporting is actually national legislation that causes this burden, and how much is European, and how much do we actually need to talk about filling gaps in the single market and increasing European legislation that might be able to make things, harmonize things and make things easier. So yeah, maybe Malte, you could come in on that. Maybe you have some views on that.
So much that was said that I would be keen to respond to. So let me try and structure a little bit and I'll start with your question. For me, what's really important to understand on the reporting discussion is we are not just seeing the reporting burden that is coming from the green, quote unquote, legislation. And there is a lot of that. And a lot of that is also important. I think no arguments that we need reporting in order to get there. So it's not a question of yes or no, it's a question of how. But the reporting burden that the companies feel goes way beyond the green legislation, because essentially every single piece of new legislation over the last 3 years, or at least for us, the important material new legislation, comes with new reporting obligations baked in. It's the case for chips, it's the case for AI, it's the case for cyber resilience, it's the case for raw materials, it's the case for net zero industry, it's the case for single market emergency instrument, and I can go on. They all come with reporting obligations. It's like this reflex, report, 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 because somehow with more information, we will get better outcomes. And so I think I can't speak to what else is going on at the national level across 37 member states. That goes way beyond the part of the picture that I see. But already at the European level, that's an important point to recognize. You were asking this question, Philipp, on how do we square the circle between sustainability, green transition, and competitiveness. I disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think there's a contradiction between green sustainability and competitiveness. And the fact that you would ask a question like that, I guess it's deliberate. It shows the problem we have. We have in Europe this reflex of we have to regulate ourselves to sustainability. And I think what a lot of the companies would say is, we are already on that journey. You don't have to force us. We will get there. And actually, we, in our case, these enabling technologies, we will help others get there faster if just you can let us get on with it. And so I don't think there's any contradiction at all, but it is the more long-term perspective that Sylvie was mentioning that is really key. And last point, and then I'll shut up on the other stuff that I had heard on the SME test. Yes, this is important. So having a kind of filter to understand what does new legislation mean for SMEs is important, and we can do better. But I think it also lures us into a false sense of security. We've done the SME test. We've done our sort of SME opt-outs or carve-outs or extra protection or whatever. But SMEs are up to 250 employees. Sylvie's company is not helped by that. And a lot of the small companies, they feel small. They are, by any kind of international comparison, small. A few hundred employees, maybe even a couple of thousand employees. They get zero benefit from the SME test. They're treated the same way as a BMW or a BASF or a Siemens. And I think what I would love to do in the context of looking at the regulatory environment is, what about that big part in the middle, which is not the big multinationals, as important as they are, and which is not the SMEs. Often the family-owned, European hidden champions. How can we help them? And how can we avoid that we just put them all in the same box as BMW and BASF and Siemens? And I'm missing that in the discussion around how do we help SMEs in Europe?
Yeah, thank you. maybe Michael Wimmer, you would like to come in on that? I think there's a lot being talked about, proportionality, but also about letting businesses off the leash a little bit more, so to say, having their own way. They have already the right long-term vision, we heard, and all these kind of things. Do you think that that could be a way forward? And yeah.
Many things have come up, and I'll try also to be as structured as I can, but just picking up the different element. I mean, what you say, and thank you also for your personal experience, because I think that makes things very, very strong. I think it is quite clear that at the abstract level, we are all aware about what our economic structure is, and of course this relies a lot. SMEs, we refer to SMEs as the backbone of our economy. It's not only SMEs, midcaps play an important role, and it's quite clear that obviously certain requirements weigh different on different companies. I think the challenge is drawing the practical conclusions of that, and this idea of the tests. Now, of course, we do have some in our better regulation system because we need to structure things a little bit. We do have some tests on some really very important issues, but I think it is also important to avoid thinking or having a proliferation of those kind of things, and then having it a mere tick box exercise, which is not really meaningful. I think the bottom line is for us, what is really important is to engage, to consult. I think also in terms of, I think we have, for example, recently with our new better regulation system, we have simplified the consultation system because we want to hear from companies like yours. And we know that it is a difference for a company like yours, even to contribute in our work and in our consultations compared to some big enterprise with their own lobby structures and whatever. So we have tried to simplify this and to differentiate also very much in terms of how we analyze the feedback. And of course, we will need to have in mind and have tried to have in mind, and certainly there are things that we can do better, the different needs of different constituencies. And I think one important thing is also that and here our consultation system, which is I think a pretty good one. I mean, the OECD ranks us first in the world in that. We are quite proud of that. But important for us is that we know stuff, and that we have possibilities for you to engage, and that we then draw conclusions. And those conclusions may be differentiation depending on companies. For example, I mean, the example that you mentioned on sustainability reporting, I think one of the things that we've concluded is that on certain reporting elements, we have changed compared to the recommendation of EFRAG. We have changed what smaller companies, and here I'm not talking about SMEs, but smaller companies below 750, I think, don't need to report that others need to report. I mean, that can be solutions. That will not always help SMEs and mid-caps, because sometimes this also gives a right. And on things like reporting requirements, I mean, sometimes reporting requirement is the more proportionate intervention compared to something that would go further. We need to see that as well. I think you mentioned it in terms of, in some areas, the focus is on transparency, because transparency is less brutal than a hard requirement. Tax country by country reporting or whatever. I mean, basically, it's about providing the tools, creating transparency, sustainability reporting as well. The alternative might be harder, but certainly there needs to be an awareness. Then on what you said on additional regulatory requirements and the single market, and I think that is actually really an important point, and it's something that we struggle with, because legally there are some legal bases where we can prevent member states from what we refer to as gold plating, but in many instances we cannot do it because if you have an environmental legal base, you cannot prevent a member state, for example, from adding something. We don't find it in general positive, because the point of our single market and the point of our legislation is precisely to somehow create a shared standard, and the point of it is actually to help companies, because it's easier, in particular a company that is active internationally, to have one rule rather than 27 rules. And that also shows, I think, why it was so challenging for us to establish in our culture things like one in, one out, because the thing is not straightforward. Sometimes one in at European level means 27 out at national level. And that is actually not something that makes life more difficult for companies, but at the contrary. The point of this is making it significantly easier. So that's then, I don't want to be too long, but a couple of other things. Coherence, very important. I think that is a point that we accept, and where we are looking into. And indeed, whenever we have evidence on that kind of thing, I think the system is now very much sensitized on that. That has different dimension. It's part of our things that we are looking at in our reporting requirements exercise. That is one important element. But there's also a forward-looking dimension. For example, what we are doing and what we are working with our legal service and with our AI specialists and whatever we are working at, is there a way of harmonizing or creating typologies of reporting requirements just so as to avoid incoherences? Because I don't deny that they exist. I mean, you have a DG working on something, they are working with others, but depending on how prominent an issue is and how big the awareness is, I do not deny that maybe here also things can happen that are not intended, and it has, I think, the attention. And then finally, just picking up on two of the financing issues that you have mentioned. You mentioned two things which were interesting. I mean, you mentioned many things that were interesting, but two things that I wanted to pick up. And you said that one challenge, particularly also for smaller players, is indeed having the information in an integrated way, because it is true that our financial architecture, for a number of reasons, is very, very complicated. Also because of the role that member states are playing, the funds, the priorities, that there are possibilities, and there need to be possibilities for them to set priorities and determine what they want to do. Otherwise, they would never agree with any kind of budget. But for example, if you look at our STEP proposal, there's one element that is maybe not so publicized, because it is in the big scheme of things probably not the big headline grabber. But one of the important elements is also that we are trying to create a one-stop shop somehow that brings together the different funding streams or information about these funding streams, and that can orient people in order to have the best possible information in relation to these strategic investments. And of course, what you said on private investment is also, of course, very, very right. We will never be able to completely and fully cover the investment needs for the green and digital transition. Quite obvious, even though our financial offer is much, much better than what actually sometimes you have the impression, because you have a reference number of the IRA of, what is it, 350 billion, something like that. I mean, look at our budget. I mean, that is significantly bigger in reality on what we invest from at public level into this green transition. But the private sector investment is super important. And one of the elements, for example, of STEP, and one that generates a big leverage is we're proposing to create a fifth window for InvestEU. We are, for that purpose, topping it up by some 4 billion. Since the guarantee covers 40%, that brings you somehow to 10 billion with a leverage effect that you have at an average level in InvestEU. This is a lot of money, actually, and that is by bringing in private sector investment, by de-risking private sector investment, which is very important, in particular for the kind of risky investments which are very often necessary in those areas. And I realize I have been too long.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you covered a lot of ground. Really made clear how complex the whole issue is, whether it's crossing the member states to the EU level, but also whether you should do more transparency rather than prescriptions. I think these are all very interesting issues that we could talk about for very long. But the time is running out, and I think we need to now turn to the QA. I'm sorry if some people couldn't speak as much as others, but we try to make good for that by replying to the questions. So please, the floor now is open. You're very welcome to direct your questions to the panel.
I even get a mic. Olav Amnes-Sursen, Equinor. The Net Zero Industrial Act seeks to introduce sandboxes, so zones where we get some favorable regulatory treatment. Can you explain a bit the background of that idea and why it focuses only on research and innovation and not of deployment? If we want to go low carbon on some sorts in industrial clusters, for example. We need to be owning things together, perhaps, sell products together. These are things that are difficult to do under competition law. We can't receive state aid together, for example. All of that is impossible under the current cumulated set of rules. But the sandbox idea never made it to the deployment phase, sort of, you know, where we deploy technologies. Is only in research and innovation. Why is that?
Yeah, please feel free.
Okay, a very specific question, but no, I mean, generally where we're coming on sandboxes and what the struggles are with sandboxes. We find sandboxes interesting. We find them interesting because they facilitate innovation, because they allow testing things, and therefore they allow us to adjust. Or their regulation is slow. Regulation is slow. Sandboxes allow somehow companies to move with in a system that is more, with a speed that is more aligned to what actually the needs are in the real world. But sandboxes are also difficult for a regulator, because we do not want to do certain things. We do not want to create law-free zones. We do not want to pick winners. We do not want to somehow substitute ourselves to the market. And striking that balance is very, very complicated, and also legally very complicated. Obviously, we do not want to create somehow special areas where competition law would not apply. And from the perspective of where the market failures are, and again, this goes deep into an economic discussion that I'm not fully mastering. But from the perspective also where the market failures are, it is clear that in the upstream, in the research and innovation perspective, that is more relevant and more easily a case to be made than on the deployment and downstream. Now, overall, this conversation, and not specifically on the sandboxes, but if you look at what we're doing, if you look at STEP, for example, if you look at state aid, if you look at all these different elements that we have put forward, I think there is an awareness that there is also a deployment issue. But still, I think we need to be, that there are some limits, there are some legal requirements as well. And particularly on issues like sandboxes, I can tell you we have very, very clearly our legal service also in our bag, and how to create them without somehow intervening in the market in a way that we don't want to intervene in the market is very challenging.
Thank you. One last question, because we're running out of time, so try to keep it short, please.
Ask one if there's nobody else. Geo-economic, I work at the EPC. A small comment on the reporting, and then a question on the reporting. Of course, everybody sees that, and you've said it. It's the multi-layers and cumulative impact of reporting that becomes challenging. And I'm wondering whether the Commission doesn't, in a way, have a particular responsibility for this. Taking just examples of the two texts that were mentioned, CSDR and CSDD, in the sense that I think they were proposed within a window of 18 months of difference in time. And of course, I know they have different origins. The sustainability reporting comes from the non-financial reporting, so it takes over past legislation. But isn't it heart of the problem here that these texts are not looked at together holistically and together, because they are driven by different parts of the Commission, and then we end up having these additional or side-by-side texts that, of course, they don't have the same aim, but they hit the same companies, and this is not being looked at holistically. So that's my part of my comment. And then I just wanted to say, in terms of, that was my question, and my comment is relating to the single market. I think that's been the big absentee in this discussion. We're talking about, or you're talking about, a very challenging international situation, competition, geo-economics, where well, most countries don't play by the same rules as us anymore. So we also know that we need to find more resources for growth and more bigger markets in the single market. But I think there is a feeling now that is quite strong that the single market is not being focused on as a priority. The Financial Times did an article not so long ago saying that the enforcement of single market rules has virtually stopped from one Commission president to the next and to the current one. And of course, the principle of the single market is not only of adding rules, but it is of harmonizing rules and also creating enabling legislation. So I'm wondering whether this better regulation agenda doesn't, in fact, go with a new focus on the single market that we talk about in the context of the 30th anniversary, but that never seems very popular to actually do something about and to take the political fights and discussions with the member states to make sure that it becomes ever more of a reality.
Thank you. If you could keep yourself short would be great because we're running out of time.
Well, very easy. If your first question was a general question, my answer is yes. If it was a specific question, my answer is no. And on the second question on the single market, just to explain, I agree we have this responsibility. I agree that there are issues. In relation to the specific aspects that you are mentioning, we have looked into that and they are actually consistent. Now, that doesn't mean that if everything were done from the start with the full emphasis and awareness of this, one might not have done things differently. But we have looked into that aspect. But in general, you're right. It's obviously, as the one who proposed, we have a big responsibility. And I think there is now also political emphasis on that and hence attention of the system. And also with our exercise, that is part of the things that we are looking at. It's not the only thing. We're also looking at who reports when, how often, can the frequencies be less, we're looking into can certain things be postponed. The postponement alone on sustainability reporting compared to the EFRAG proposal, I think is worth 1.1 billion if you just try to cost that. On the single market, I agree with you. I mean, the single market is a super important asset. The enforcement I mentioned is important, is maybe something that requires attention. I agree with you. Does also have attention. I would not agree that somehow with the implication that the Commission is not taking that seriously. But I guess the fact that you're creating certain leeways by a temporary crisis framework in competition, I mean, by definition, you are creating additional possibilities, and some will find that not enough, and some will find that from your single market perspective is going too far. But the rules that we have, we are trying to enforce them strongly. I agree that in a longer term perspective also, I would expect the enforcement dimension to be very present and important. And so I see where you're coming from, and I agree with you that the single market and the enforcement of the single market rules is very, very important.
Thank you very much. And with that, we're coming to the end of this policy dialogue. Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in online and also for coming, of course, here in person. For those who are here in person, I would like to point out we also have a little lunch prepared in the room right next to this one. So feel free to stay for a little while, discuss, and have lunch. So thank you again, and have a nice day.